Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to our first episode of 2025, where we dive into the relationship between China and Russia and its implications for U.S. foreign policy. We'll look at how this relationship has evolved over the past decades across its diplomatic, military, and economic dimensions, and how the alliance has challenged the international order and impacted American strategic interests. To discuss all this, we examine a new report from the Council on Foreign Relations entitled No Limits: The China-Russia Relationship and U.S. Foreign Policy, with one of the report's authors, Richard Fontaine.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Fontaine. Richard is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. Prior to CNAS, Richard was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and served in the State Department and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He also served as Associate Director for Near Eastern Affairs at the National Security Council and worked on Southeast Asian issues in the NSC's Asian Affairs Directorate. In 2024, Richard co-authored The Lost Decade: The U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power with Ambassador Robert Blackwill. Please find the book in our show notes, as well as a link to Robert and Richard's recent report. Let's listen in on the conversation. All right, welcome everybody to our first episode of this season of Diplomatic Immunity. And I'm excited to be joined today by Richard Fontaine, who is the CEO of the Center for New American Security. And he just came out with a report that he co-authored with Robert Blackwill called No Limits: The China-Russia Relationship and U.S. Foreign Policy. Richard, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so my first question today, I read the report on a train ride to New York City on Saturday and thought it was great and very timely and interesting. So basically, to give our listeners an idea on why this is happening, what is driving today's China-Russia relationship? And can you give us a little bit of a flavor of why it's different from past decades?
Well, China and Russia, as those with any sense of certainly Cold War history will know, were linked up together in ideological spirit from 1949 until the Sino-Soviet split. And then, of course, the U.S. famously normalized relations with China in part to move the chess pieces around the strategic chessboard and build a broader front against the Soviet Union. And then in the post-Cold War era, pursued, I think you could say, good relations or at least engagement with both China and Russia at the same time. And over the past few years, China and Russia have moved closer and closer together, certainly under Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a big boost for reasons we can get into in terms of operational and sort of concrete economic, technological, military cooperation. There was a large, long joint manifesto that the two leaders issued just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, talking about this so-called no limits partnership. And really the glue that holds them together is a shared antipathy for what the two countries believe to be an unfairly Western and especially U.S. dominated international order that doesn't accord to them the space and power and strength and sphere of influence and standing that they believe they deserve by virtue of their power and history and civilization and demographic and economic weight. And they're determined to do something about it. And a lot of the agenda that flows from their cooperation today stems from this impulse to do something about it rather than to just pursue a different sort of relationship with the United States or kind of marginal changes to the international order.
So I've seen a lot of reports that talk about this relationship in terms of past analogies and, people talking about the Axis during the 1930s, or you mentioned the previous Sino-Soviet relationship in the early Cold War. So do you find it useful to think of this in terms of analogies when comparing the strength or the actual threat of this relationship to the United States? Or Is there another analogy out there that you find that is useful to look at when considering today's China-Russia relationship?
I think analogies, historical analogies in particular, and I've written some about this, have very significant limitations. I mean, they can help you ask the right questions, but they almost never supply the right answers. And when one thinks that everything is like Munich or like 1914 or like whatever your favorite analogy is, you're usually on the road to perdition. That said, it can help you ask some of the right questions, and, especially in a comparative way. I mean, if you look at the Axis powers in World War II, the three were not collaborating as closely then, certainly not Japan with Germany and Italy, as Russia and China are today. I mean, the level of collaboration is more significant now. The one kind of analogy that we put in our report is actually a reference to a line from Bismarck when there were five great powers in Europe. And Bismarck famously said, in a world of five great powers, you should try to be one of the three, not one of the two.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, today, in a world of three great powers, the United States finds itself not in the two, but in the one. And that opens up a set of questions for what that actually means and what we do about it, what our allies are, and things like that. But I think those are the ways to think about what's happening today, rather than just kind of a cookie cutter, this is a replay of, pick your favorite historical analog.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer. As some of our longtime listeners may know, I teach a course on history's influence on foreign affairs that I'll be starting to teach again next week. And this is often what I talk about with students when we get to the analogies, is that you can get into trouble very quickly with analogies, but oftentimes when you really interrogate them, they do lead you to asking the right kind of questions and like really diving into what the problem at the moment is, when you actually have to compare it to something else, go back to Neustadt and May and the likenesses and differences and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So it can be a useful exercise, but you also have to have a large grain of salt when you look at analogies. And, you talked about what they're doing in the partnership today, and we'll get to that in a second. But I want to get to something you talked about in the report. You went into a little bit of a detail on how each side views the relationship. So, how is Russia viewing the relationship? How is China viewing the relationship? Are they viewing it the same, or are they on, different pages here?
There's some significant similarities, but there's also important departures in the way they see the relationship and what they see as the way ahead. I mean, both of them obviously see utility in the relationship in a way that they haven't for most of the post-Cold War period. Russia gets technology and parts and economic inputs from China that have been cut off by the West or diminished by the West, especially for its war in Ukraine. Multiple foreign officials have said that without the Chinese non-military or dual use support for the war in Ukraine, then Russia's effort would more or less grind to a halt. So that's quite significant. The Russians, like to make a lot, and increasingly are, of the notion that while the West increasingly points to Russian isolation diplomatically, economically, and otherwise, Russia and Putin will say we're all but isolated. We have not only this relationship with China, but what my colleague Andrea Kendall-Taylor and I have called the axis of upheaval that include Iran and North Korea, together with the BRICS and elsewhere. And they say, look, this represents a huge proportion of global GDP and even more than that in demographic weight and population. And so, China is useful to Russia diplomatically and certainly within the UN and things like that. On the flip side, China sees in Russia a source of some military technology, certainly low cost hydrocarbons that are not traveling over the seas to arrive in China, which in a dust up with the United States could be vulnerable to the US Navy. But also, again, an ideological partner, not just, a minor rogue state like North Korea or something, but one that is rejectionist of key elements of this Western dominated, as they would say, global order. So they see utility in both sides, but of course, there's also a difference in outlook. The Chinese tend to be much more risk averse than the Russians in almost every way that one could care about something. And this works its way in terms of their psychology of foreign policy. And whether they think a stable or unstable region or world is good or bad for them, but also in very concrete ways. I mean, instability in the Middle East that drives up the price of oil is good for Russia and bad for China, right? So Russia has an interest in tolerating more risk than China does. So there are some differences in outlook, but I think it's important to note that these differences in outlook and even in kind of instinct, foreign policy instinct, are by no means sufficient to drive a significant wedge between the two. The glue that holds them together, the shared agenda, is much more significant than the differences.
So you mentioned a couple things like Russian oil and things like that the Chinese are aiding them economically. And in your report, you dive into three separate categories: diplomatic, military, and economic. So how is this relationship playing out in the real world? What are they actually doing in those different spheres to strengthen this relationship in ways that we haven't seen in the past?
Well, on the military side, has been for a long time and is now a very important military relationships in terms of weapon sales and technology. There's still some areas in which Russia is ahead of China. China may be catching up, but in areas like submarine quieting technology and maybe in jet engines and areas like that. We talked about Chinese inputs into Russia's ability to make war in Ukraine, which are critical. And that has really increased. China has replaced to a large degree Western parts and components and things like that, including in areas like semiconductors and things that Russia really requires in order to keep that going and fundamentally to keep its broader military economy going. So, going both ways on the military side, you see in terms of flows, high level of activity. You also see this in terms of exercises and the other attributes of military cooperation, including, joint China-Russia warplane incursion into Alaska's air defense identification zone some time ago, and joint exercises in the South China Sea and things like that, and also bringing in new partners together with the two of them to do these kinds of things. So on the military side, now they're not going to fight for each other. You're not going to see Chinese troops do what North Korea has done,
right?
Ukraine or vice versa, if it came to that. But below the level of mutual defense agreement, which they don't have, there's quite a lot that is at least publicly reported that's going on the military level and potentially more beyond that we just don't know about. On the diplomatic level, over the years, they've increasingly harmonized their approaches at the UN Security Council. And, China used to more or less be in the slipstream behind Russia and would often abstain on UN Security Council votes that it didn't like rather than veto them and so forth. But now they tend to vote in lockstep, so in terms of multilateral diplomacy, even on things that wouldn't necessarily seem to unite them, on votes on Syria or, humanitarian aid. So they're increasingly harmonized on the diplomatic side. And again, they're also trying to multilateralize outside the UN in terms of the BRICS, to some degree the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but really the BRICS, and have kind of a joint appeal to the so-called global South, that diplomatically, the United States and the Western allies are a neo-imperialist power that foists its own parochial ideals on the world and is engaged in activities one might object to in places like Gaza, whereas China and Russia are standing up for the little guy, I guess you could say. I mean, it's a hard argument really to kind of wrap one's head around, but nevertheless, it seems to resonate in quite a few countries, including ones I've been to in the last year or so. And then finally, on the economic side, as the U.S. and as the West has increasingly isolated Russia, it's become more and more dependent on China's economy as opposed to anything else. China is not terribly dependent on Russia as an economy. I mean, it's an asymmetric relationship in that sense. But there are significant benefits, the chief one of which, again, is oil and gas and to some degree military technology. And as China wishes to sort of sanctions-proof its economy and make its economy less vulnerable to Western pressure, then Russia is only one answer to that.
So my next question, I don't want to call this a pet peeve of mine, but people have been talking about the China-Russia relationship and the growing partnership over the past few years lately, and we oftentimes see that it is China and Russia versus the United States. And you mentioned the Bismarck quote, and I get the fact that, it's the three great powers. So there is a reason to do that. You also mentioned in your report the importance of allies. But when we do the comparisons, it's often the U.S. versus China and Russia. and it's not the U.S. and its allies versus China and Russia. So, what's the distinction in your mind, and why methodologically did you guys decide to go the route you did?
Well, and we put a big emphasis, particularly in our recommendations, about utilizing, working more closely with, and reaping the value of our alliance systems. And to some degree, it depends on what issue you're talking about, right? The economic side is different than the military side and so forth. That said, possibly the biggest advantage the United States does have is this global alliance system. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the United States has more or less all the G7 countries, all of Western and Central Europe, 5 treaty allies in Asia, and then a number of countries that are not alliances in the strict sense, but tend to be aligned with the United States for all intents and purposes, right? That's a huge advantage. China has North Korea, Cambodia. Russia has Belarus, on a good day, I guess. I don't know, maybe Venezuela, but I mean, neither of those are adding much weight. And you're looking at this from a competitive standpoint, not economically, not militarily, certainly not diplomatically. And I think that in part explains this significant outreach that both China and Russia have been doing to other countries beyond those, right? To say, well, this is really about a broader set of countries, largely in the global south. But even then, I mean, the BRICS are not allies.
Right.
And, you sort of have to look really hard to find what unites them together beyond a high level of abstraction. And I mean, the SCO is not allies. So it is wrong to look at this only as, there's a scale, and on one side of the scale, there's the United States, and on the other side of the scale is China and Russia. It's really, China and Russia and its allies and potential partners on one side, and the U.S. and its allies and partners on the other side. That said, key to that methodological assessment, I think, is what are the strengths and action potentials for real among those allies? Because it's great to say you got a bunch of allies, but if in the lurch they won't amount to much, that's very different. And so that in turn puts a premium on having good alliance relationships. And we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, that we will. So I want to dive deeper into some of your actual recommendations from the report, which I think are really good. You already mentioned the axis of upheaval that you guys have coined, and talking about some of these other sort of pseudo allies of Russia and China that you mentioned. And one of your recommendations is to work to offset the axis of upheaval. So, getting into that, I want to ask you, what has the seemingly weakened Iran and the fall of the Assad regime in Syria meant in terms of this larger axis of upheaval? And more importantly, is there anything we can take away from the fall of the Assad regime, the inability or unwillingness of Russia to step in and try to do anything there? What are your takeaways from that in terms of this broader relationship?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the axis of upheaval is a significant phenomenon. It's a major challenge. It's a threat to a lot of the outcomes the United States and its friends and partners would like to see obtain in the world. But it's not monolithic.
Right.
It's also not impermeable to events. And it's not static any more than the U.S. and its relationships are static. And frankly, if I had to bet on the future of one being more solid than the other, I'd bet on us than the axis of upheaval. That again doesn't mean that it's not highly problematic and we shouldn't rise to that challenge. But the changing of Iran's fortunes in the last year, a perfect example of this. I mean, in the past year, Iran has been significantly weakened in terms of its offensive capabilities. The effectiveness of ballistic missiles, which on the military side was the pointy end of the spear, doesn't look very effective. Hezbollah was its strongest proxy, been very significantly diminished. And, Assad was one of its most important client states. And he's living in a suburb of Moscow with his family now. And it looks like, by popular accounts, that Russia is removing its equipment and forces from the base in Tartus. Now, who knows whether they'll keep that base, but at a minimum, they were unable or unwilling to step in to save their regime. And the Russians emphasized for years and years in the Middle East that where the United States, pulls out of Afghanistan or makes a mess in Libya, the Russians, stick by their friends and stick by their allies, and they're in there for the long haul and they can be counted on. Well, nope, they can't be. Nor can the Iranians, who again were unwilling or unable and basically went home and let Assad fall rather than try to fight and save him. So, those kinds of outcomes are entirely possible. And that's a blow to the standing of this broader grouping and to some of the reputational capital that they've tried to earn, again, as, well, when we're with you, you get all of us and you get everything and we're not going anywhere. Well, it doesn't always work that way. It's hard to see, the other three members of the axis of upheaval dealing with the same kind of crisis in the near term that certainly Iran has gone through. But, I think the most interesting thing to watch here is what the Russian role in the military in the Middle East will be, if really any, post this. And especially because China is not much of a player in that region.
Right.
So, in the space of 10 months or something, the strategic picture in the Middle East has changed rather dramatically.
So you also mention and recommend that the U.S. really focuses on what really matters in terms of this challenge and not taking a shotgun approach kind of to every little thing that's going on everywhere and pushing back against the Russia-China cooperation and relationship. And you say, and I'm going to quote from the report now, you say, quote, actions by Moscow or Beijing that would contest key principles of international order, constrict Washington's freedom to act, or undermine the domestic functioning of foreign countries should broadly define what is most important. Could you give us a few specific examples of what you meant by that?
Sure. I think here's where I actually think a historical analogy might help us ask a good question or two. Because, during the Cold War, the United States believed that it had to resist the geographic expansion of communism everywhere in the world, or at least it believed that for several decades of the Cold War. And so if you look back, that meant things like saying that, the fall of Berlin to communist forces was so important the United States was willing to sacrifice a major city in order to protect it. In retrospect, I think that probably was a good policy. If you look at the fact that in the course of the first half of the 20th century and twice the U.S. crossed the ocean to stop them, and you look at the historical and economic and other ties with Europe and everything else. The United States also concluded that the domestic politics of Laos were so important that it needed to wage a 12-year war in order to affect them and ensure that they didn't go communist and drop more bombs on that country than had been dropped in all of World War II. Now, at least in retrospect, that looks like overkill. Leave Vietnam aside, leave Cambodia aside, leave domino theory aside, leave everything else. And by the way, Laos is still communist today. So, it didn't work. But leaving aside the utility of that, is that the right way to expend our national security resources in order to avoid outcomes that we might not like, but nevertheless may not be critical to our own national interests? And I think the question today is, what is a Berlin and what is a Laos, right? We prefer that Chinese and Russian influence all over the world is diminished or does not rise, but where does it matter the most? And I think there's some guiding principles, and you mentioned, at a high level of abstraction, kind of what we nodded to in there. But so, for example, we don't like the idea of China getting military bases anywhere in the world. It has a global basing strategy. We don't like that. But Chinese military bases in some places are more problematic to us than others. So if the Chinese military bases are in Equatorial Guinea, which it is pursuing, it's not great, but a Chinese base in West Africa would be less deleterious to the U.S. Navy's ability to operate than would a Chinese base in the Pacific Islands or in Southeast Asia. Okay, there is a certain priority then flows exactly from that, right? Big principles of international order. Well, what's the biggest principle of all of international order? It's the cardinal rule against territorial expansion by force. Well, who has just violated that? Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, that certainly puts, I think, a priority on resisting that transgression and punishing and raising the cost for that transgression so as to not see that particular element of international order eroded. Whereas, yes, there's lots of bits of international order. Some are shabbier than others, and we're not going to fight for them all, or not going to aid the fighters for them all. But that is one worth standing up to. So those are a couple of examples of what we mean in practice.
So you also talk about trade, obviously a big issue in U.S. politics and foreign affairs over the past decade. And you note that the U.S. needs to do a better job of coming up with good trade deals and with Asia and other areas. What would that look like?
Well, at this point, it looked like anything. I mean,
Fair point.
we haven't had a dynamic, we haven't had an affirmative trade policy, a positive trade policy since TPP went belly up
Yeah.
in 2016. And, there's virtually no chance we're going back to TPP anytime in the near future. And since then, we've had a defensive policy that's focused on tariffs and Buy America provisions and protectionism of various sorts that is attempting to protect the American economy from the effects of others rather than open opportunities for the American economy and for others. But if you look, again, in the context of this competition with China and Russia, we are not like China where we direct capital and tell, company X, Y, or Z to go invest billions of dollars in this country because it would be good for our foreign policy. But what we do have is the world's biggest market and an enormous stock of capital. And so to allow access to those things through trade agreements seems to be not only economically beneficial for the United States, but also potentially generative of foreign policy and strategic benefits and signal connection and, frankly, benefits for our allies and friends and things like that. Then you add to it the fact that we're trying to decouple key parts of the U.S.-China economic relationship where we believe there's national security risk. Okay, fine. But then we can either build those things ourselves or we can trade with others. How about trading with others? So, go down on U.S.-China and go up on U.S. fill-in-the-blank partner. Now, we're not doing any of that, and the politics of trade are terrible, and everybody knows that. But it is not beyond the realm of belief to think that we might be able to get, sectoral agreements, either multilateral, bilateral, in areas like digital trade or critical minerals or green technology and things like that. And potentially even broader trade agreements on the bilateral front. I mean, I still think that TPP or its successor CPTPP is a good idea, but that makes me a party of almost one these days. So we have to live in the world of reality, politically and otherwise. But that doesn't mean you can do nothing. And what we've done for 8 years is nothing.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm glad you mentioned critical minerals. We have a ISD report on critical minerals coming out in the next month, hopefully. So, all right, I'll get you out of here on the one last question. So you also recommend in the report increasing defense spending. The defense budget's a big talking point, whether or not it's increasing it or actually doing more with less, but you guys recommend increasing it. So how do you suggest going about that when we also have non-discretionary spending at all-time highs and other things like infrastructure and global health and things like this that we need to pay for? So what are some of the specific examples there?
Well, we didn't go through a budget exercise of what to cut or what taxes to raise or how much more to borrow in order to pay for a bigger defense budget. Although I would point out just two things with respect to this. One, in terms of the relative level of defense spending, we're about 3% of GDP on defense spending now, which is about the level in 1999 when we're sort of the height of the peace dividend. The world's obviously a very different place. And if you look at the concrete manifestations of that, I mean, there's Chinese military modernization and expansion, and then the demands in Europe and the Middle East. I mean, the demand signal for U.S. defense resources is high. So that's point one. And then the second is just that deterrence tends to be a lot cheaper than fighting a war. I mean, Brown University does a tracker of the costs of the post 9/11 wars. And I think they put the total, sort of life cycle cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, something like $5 trillion. I mean, that was Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, God forbid we get in a war with China, and so if an extra $100 billion a year, or whatever the number is, would deter a war that would otherwise cost way north of $5 trillion, that's money well spent just from a sheer sort of budgeting standpoint. Now, that said, the money has to come from somewhere. I mean, if you're in the world of should and not in the world of political reality, I mean, entitlements are the biggest driver of the U.S. budget. And then we have interest on the debt, which is about the level of defense spending now to which we keep contributing. And then we have a big looming question about whether to renew the Trump tax cuts or not. I mean, those almost seem baked in, that the answers are going to go renew the tax cuts, don't touch entitlements, rail about the deficit, but keep paying the interest on the debt and just keep borrowing money. That is a suboptimal position. So, I think maybe if you and I had 20 minutes, we could probably come up with a better accounting for how to put all of that together. But ultimately, it's a political
Right.
decision that is not going to be driven, as much as I lament it, by national security policymakers designing what's optimal.
Yeah, the politics tends to get in the way often. All right, Richard Fontaine, thank you so much. And I recommend everybody read the report. We will put it in our show notes so folks can easily find that. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Richard for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.